Welcome to Chandu's TechNet. This is part 2 of high availability and disaster recovery solutions available for SQL Server. Right. So we discussed in previous video what are all options we have for HADR solution. Right. So these are the solutions that we have for high availability and disaster recovery. Right. So failover cluster, we consider this as a high availability solution, whereas database mirroring we use for high availability and disaster recovery solution, and log shipping is for mainly disaster recovery, and always on availability group is for high availability and disaster recovery option, whereas backup and restore we use for disaster recovery. Right. In this video, we mostly cover on failover cluster and the feature that we have. Right. This is the typical diagram of failover cluster. Before we jump into a failover cluster, I'll just give you an outline or high level overview why we even need a high availability and disaster recovery solution. I have explained in a detailed video in my previous one of my videos, so that you will understand, go through that and you will understand in a better way. Why we need a high availability and disaster recovery? The main purpose of high availability and disaster recovery is to meet your SLAs, right? SLA is your service level agreement, right? Between the client and the the client and the organization, right? Whenever there is an issue, then you will have to make sure that you bring the services online within this agreement, right? There are main two factors to meet that SLA. Those are RPO, RTO, right? RPO is data loss, right? RTO is downtime, right? Data are, for example, you have 10 a.m. your server is down. Server is down. And 10:30 a.m. you brought the services online, right? So you, like, the services down at 10 a.m. you brought the services online at 10:30 a.m. So this 30 minutes, call it as a downtime. That is your time to recover your data, right? How much time you took to recover your data. Now, so 30 minutes is downtime, right? That 30 minutes, how much data you lost to recover the database or whatever data you have. In this 30 minutes, how much data you lost? That is what we call it as a recovery point objective. At what time, until what time you would be able to recover your data, called recovery point objective. How much data you're able to data loss, right? What is the data loss for this 30 minutes? That is called RPO, recovery point objective. Now, let's consider how you will maintain even SLA, proper SLA, so that you will have to have a high availability and disaster recovery solution. Let's take an example. You have you have one server, and if something, you have some data here. You have some data in this server. Anything you can consider. You have only one server, server A, and you have only one server, and you have some data inside this server. What if this is lost? This is gone. If this is gone, then your data is gone. Like, you don't have data to, you don't have so access to the data. You are not able to access, and it's kind of down. Your application this is your application which uses the data. Application or end user, whatever you call it as, they are using this data. Right now, if this server is down, then application has broken. Your application has broken and your application is down. Until you brought this server online, you would not be able to access the data. Right, this is a huge loss. This server crashed because of n number of reasons, right? So maybe CPU crashed, or a motherboard issue, or hardware issue, or operating system issue, or any issue you can consider. If this is gone, that's it. So it's a single point of failure. To overcome this, we have concept of high availability. So to configure high availability, we need two or more than two servers to maintain that data. For example, you have another server, server B. And if you have a communication established between the servers, right? You have a communication between the servers. Whenever there is a failure, and immediately the data should be moved from there to here, and it should be accessible to the application, right? Whenever this is gone, and your data should be available on the another server, whichever partner to this particular server should be able to make a connection with the application. So application should be able to connect to B node, so that how much time, so you lost the how much, what is your RTO and RPO here? Like you will have very less RPO and RTO, because whenever there is a crash or whenever there is an issue here on this node, immediately the other node will respond stating that, hey, I have your data, you go ahead and connect. So this application will connect to server B. This is called high availability concept, right? High availability or disaster recovery, you can consider that. Now, let's go ahead and connect the same logic. This data, how this move to here, right? Instead of keeping this data locally, what concept we have in all SQL Server Failover cluster, instead of keeping this data locally, we keep that data in a separate storage. We call it as shared storage, right? In the shared storage, we have the data available, right? For example, let's consider a small scenario. If the data is available on this node itself, right? On this node itself, what if the system is crashed? The data will not be available, and how the data will be moved to other node? The data would not be would not be able to move, right? Because we have only one copy of data available. So to maintain that access, to maintain that data available, we will not keep the data within the server. I mean, within the server, as in like we will not have, there is a separate storage where we keep the data, where this storage will be accessed by both the servers. So we call this as a shared, right? Shared storage between the servers. So whenever the services online on the node, whenever the resources are online, whenever the resources are hosted, I mean, wherever the resources are hosted, this storage is available for that particular server, right? So whenever there is an issue happen, like for example, this is crashed, then this storage will be moved to the other node and data will be available here. Now, this is how the shared storage and the data will be accessed. Cool. Now let's understand the SQL Server perspective. SQL Server, we install a one it is SQL Failover cluster is nothing but a single instance with multiple nodes. What does it mean? So you will have to install a single instance of the cluster, whereas you will be adding multiple nodes, one or more nodes to the same instance, right? So you are installing SQL Server here, and this node you are joining to the cluster. And if you have another node, that node also will be joined to the cluster, right? These are all are partners. You can consider that these three are partners. At any point of time, only one node is acting as an active server. What does it mean? If this is A is active, the SQL Server services are running on this node, whereas the all other partners, the SQL services will be in a stop state, because those are just joined to the server, that joined to the cluster. Those are not actual SQL instances. It is just a partners to the cluster instance, right? If something goes wrong here, if something goes wrong to node A, then everything will be moved. The SQL services will be stopped here, and the SQL services will be come online on any of these nodes. I will tell you what is the preference to fail over the resources, right? The failover happens. Who did the failover? Again, Windows cluster initiate the failover based on the health conditions. And once failover happens, all resources come online on this node, whereas SQL services will be started on this node. Again, the storage is shared, right? It should move the storage from node A to node B. The storage will be hosted again on node B. So it is accessible for any server. Wherever the resource failure happens, the storage will be go ahead and attach to that particular server, right? If this is down, failure happens to this storage will be accessed to the other node as well, so that it will be attached to the other node and the services will come online, right? So in this shared storage, you will have everything related to SQL Server. Everything as in you will have system databases, you will have user databases, you will have SQL Server error logs and other files which are relevant to SQL Server, right? The reason, like, so whenever you move the resources, whenever you failure happens, SQL Server should come online, right? If the SQL Server system databases are not available, then your SQL servers would not come online. So the storage should be available wherever the failover happens, right? The reason this is since at any point of time only one node is active, all others are passive, we call this as a high availability solution, right? High availability is nothing but the data is always available without any downtime, right? But we are not guaranteed for recovery point objective if there is a storage failure. If there is a storage failure, then it is a kind of single point of failure. This is the main disadvantage with the SQL cluster. If the storage is failed, then it is completely a single point of failure. You cannot bring the resources online on any of the nodes because the storage contains the system databases, user databases, startup parameter related information, everything. I mean, startup parameter related information as in SQL error log details, everything will be stored in the shared storage. If this is gone, SQL service would not come online until and unless you bring the data storage online. That is the main reason for we don't call it as disaster recovery. So if there is a site failure, for example, uh, for example, mm, uh, if for example, like so if the storage is not accessible, you cannot recover the other node, right? So if the storage is failure, that is a point of failure. Only high availability we maintain. High availability is nothing but whenever there is a failure happen, then immediately fail over to other node and will bring the resources online, and storage should be available as well, right? So that is a SQL failover cluster. Let's understand what are all prerequisites to configure the SQL cluster, right? Prerequisites are, we should have to have a window prerequisites for SQL FC. Prerequisites to configure SQL FC. Okay, first one, we should have to have a Windows cluster configured. Okay, so we should have to have a Windows cluster configured to configure SQL cluster instance. Of course, this is required. Why we need this Windows cluster? Because for automatic failover and failover, whatever it happens through the Windows cluster itself. Right. To configure the Windows cluster, what are all prerequisites that you need to configure the Windows cluster? We should have to have a 2 or more Windows nodes, servers or nodes. In the cluster point of view, we call it as a nodes, but you can consider as a servers as well, or missions, whatever you consider. Node is nothing but joining the servers to the Windows cluster. You need to have a 2 or more Windows servers. Cluster feature to be enabled or installed, right? We should have to have Windows Fellow cluster feature to be enabled on all the cluster nodes. Right. We should have a Windows Fellow cluster feature to be enabled. Other than that, you cannot configure a Windows cluster. Now, we should have one private IP and one public IP per node, right? If you have a two servers, two node failover cluster, you should have to have a two private IPs and two public IP for both the servers, right? Why private IP and why public IP is needed? Private IP is for heartbeat check or communication, right? Private IP is for heartbeat check or heartbeat communication. You have two servers in the cluster, and using the private IP of these nodes, the heartbeat will be checked. These two will be communicated with each other and verify that whether these are online or not. So those kind of checks, it will be performed through the heartbeat. This is an internal communication between the servers or between the nodes. Whereas private IPs, whereas public IP, the name itself, so it's telling that the public IP is for the client communication, or client is nothing but not only the application, anywhere, like if you are trying to access any of these nodes from outside of these servers, we use through the public IP. Client or application connection. So you have a client or application, whereas you access the servers using the public IP. Public IP. Public IP, right? So you will have to connect using the public IP. If you are accessing the servers from outside of these missions, you will be using the public IP. These two internal communication happens, or heartbeat or health check between the servers happen through private IP, right? You need heartbeat check, whereas public you need client server communication, right? So client server communication. Now you need, where I am, right? So we need one failover cluster. Sorry. Okay. We need Windows cluster network name. I said Windows cluster because even you have a SQL cluster network name as well. Here, Windows cluster. To configure a Windows cluster, we should have to provide a network name. That is a virtual network name. Why is virtual network name? Because even cluster, the Windows cluster services, Windows cluster will have to host on one of these nodes at any point of time, right? For example, if you take this cluster service, this is the Windows cluster. One sec. Right. So this is a Windows cluster. And if you see that 2012 R2 Win cluster, whatever .technet.local, this is called Windows cluster name. Okay, 1 sec, it is. Right. So if you see here, and this is the so way that you'll have to install the cluster. You will have to go to server manager. So how to enable cluster feature, right? We were talking, we should have to have a cluster feature enabled on all the nodes, and you will have to go to server manager, and from server manager, go to server manager, and you have here add roles and features, and click next. And you can select any of the nodes to install the features. If you click, you will have that roles, whatever roles that you need to install, and click features, right? If you see that Failover clustering feature, you will have to enable on all the Windows cluster nodes, right? To have a Windows cluster feature enabled. Right here, if you see, this is the cluster name, right? If it is a physical and bind to one server, then what happens to that particular server is failed, then other server will not come online, right? And if this is the cluster, whereas it is currently hosted on n node 2. If node 2 is failed, then this entire cluster should online on node 1, right? That is called high availability. If it is a physical, that is not possible. So the reason we will have to have a virtual network name and virtual IP. cluster. Okay, sec. Fine. So Windows cluster network name, virtual network name we required. I'll note down here, Windows cluster virtual network name and virtual IP to bind to the network name, right? So we should have a Windows cluster virtual network name to configure the Windows cluster, and we require the virtual IP, right? These are mandate for Windows cluster configuration, right? These are all main required. Windows cluster like two nodes and feature enabled and public IPs and private IP required, and Windows cluster virtual network name. Cool. This is the configuration for the prerequisite for Windows cluster. Let's understand the prerequisites for cluster, right? Nothing much for cluster, but cluster SQL cluster, SQL failover cluster prerequisites, right? What are all SQL failover cluster prerequisites? Main three things. One, you need to have a SQL cluster virtual network name, and you need to have a IP address bind to that network name, IP, virtual IP address, and you need to have a shared storage. I told you, right? Shared storage contains the database files and error log and all our other related SQL files, whereas failover happen from one server to another server. All the resources should go and come online on the other node along with this storage. And once the storage is online, then SQL services will be able to start. I mean, SQL service will be able to access the storage and bring the databases online, right? So the virtual network, virtual IP, and this virtual network name. Why that is virtual network name? Again, the same logic that we have, right? Whenever failover happens, your application should be able to access. Now, what will happen? Failover happens. What will happen after failover? Right. So you have node A and node B, and you have something here called as shared storage. You have something called shared storage and sharing between the nodes. Whenever this is active, it connects to here. Whenever failover happens, then this should be moved to here and should come online on this node. Storage should to move to B and should be online. Now, virtual network name, right? We are talking about. So we install SQL Server, SQL instance. While installing, we will have to provide a network name. Why that network name is needed? I'll tell you, right? So in the application, whenever application connects, right? Application uses this virtual network name. Application uses virtual network name, right? So with the help of virtual network name, whenever failover happens from this node to this node, right? Whenever failover happens from this node to this node, this virtual network name is common for both, right? The virtual network name is virtual. Like it is whenever failover happens, all the resources along with this network name also move from node A to node B. So the virtual network name should be online on node B as well. So that application will connect to the node B, right? So application should be able to connect to node B using the virtual network name so that you will not have high downtime window, right? So you will be able to connect it with a very few minimum downtime, right? So that is the reason we need a network name to be configured. So virtual network name we require to have application redirection whenever there is a failover happens from one server to another server, right? This is a high level understanding of the SQL Server failover cluster, right? I hope this helps. Uh, Please go through and let me know if you have any questions or comment below so that I will try to cover in next video. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye bye.